Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet. He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
There's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, you know, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
I was born and bred in a beautiful little town just north of London called Luton. And I always feel like I have to apologise for that. And I think it's because Luton is one of those places which at first glance appears to have very few redeeming features. But let me tell you, I lived there for a number of years, and when you scratch beneath the surface, you find it has none, actually. But it's my hometown, I love it, I'm very fond of it. And I've worked out it's just one of those places where you have to dig a little bit deeper to see the beauty. You have to have eyes to see the beauty that's actually in that town. So for example, here's the picture, here's the kind of, the view from outside the house I grew up in. And they, you can see the shop and the concrete bollards around it, and they look like bollards to stop ram raids, and that is what they're for. But someone's taken the trouble to paint them a fetching shade of green, which actually matches the shutters. And that doesn't come for free, you know, people have actually put work in there, so you just have to have eyes to see the beauty. And my parents had actually been missionaries in China, and they returned to England before I was born, so church and faith were part of my life from a really young age. And I then went to quite a rough high school. It's what these days you'd call a failing school, largely because it failed, and they knocked it down. And it was kind of known as the worst high school in Luton. It was quite a difficult accolade to achieve. And when I started there, I realized quite quickly that I was one of only 2 or 3 students in the whole school of 800 who had any kind of faith or went to church. And it suddenly became apparent to me that you didn't have to believe these things. Lots of people didn't. And at the same time, all my friends at church stopped coming and they walked away from their faith. So I was forced to work out for myself what I actually believed about Jesus. There came a point where I had to make a decision on the evidence. Is all this stuff I've been brought up with true? I couldn't just believe something that wasn't true. I couldn't just put my head in the sand and hope it was true or pretend it was true. I couldn't take some kind of blind jump of faith. I needed some evidence. For me personally, evidence has always been very important. And after Luton, I went on to read law at Oxford, and actually I studied and worked as a lawyer for 10 years. I worked as a barrister, specializing in defending people who'd been accused of criminal offenses. And actually, over the years, I represented hundreds, probably over 1,000 people accused of crimes. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. And every day, for years, the first question was always, what is the evidence about the events? How does the case stack up? The question I asked every day for years was, what is the evidence? And when it comes to who is Jesus, I'm convinced by the evidence. Well, what evidence is there? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, answers the questions how and when. It doesn't answer the question who and why. So suppose I invited you over to my house. We only just met, but you seem like a nice bunch, and we're kind of, I'm getting to know you, and I just think, why don't you come around, just hang out for a bit, and we kind of go to the, you knock on the door, and I open the door, and you come in, and we go through, and I say, come into the kitchen, and I come into the kitchen, and there in front of me, the kettle is boiling, and you say, why is the kettle boiling? Well, there's a number of different ways I could answer that question. I could say, oh, the kettle's boiling because there's a heat source and there's a transfer of thermal energy across the container wall, passing into the liquid, and into the fluid and causing an increase in the mean square velocity of the molecules proportionate to the temperature. And when that hits 100 degrees C, there will be a collective phase transition by which the condensed liquid will be transposed into a gaseous state. Could say that. Or I could just say, actually, the kettle's boiling because I wanted to make you a cup of tea because actually I just really want to spend some time getting to know you. Now, they're both good answers. One tells you what is happening, how it's happening, but the other tells you why it's happening and who has kind of initiated it and why they've initiated it. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, because you can't prove that there is no God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to look tonight at the historical evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. For lawyers, historical evidence is highly important. That's what you put before a jury. The jury weren't witnesses to the events. They have to listen to the witnesses. They have to listen to the historical evidence and take a step of faith every time they bring in a verdict. They have to take a step of faith based on the evidence they've heard. And I myself could not be a Christian if it required me to take some kind of blind leap of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of taking a step of faith based on the good historical evidence about the life, the death, and in particular, the resurrection of Jesus. But sometimes people say, well, hang on a second, I don't even believe there's a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? And I understand that. It might seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest is that, say, if I want to know you, I can learn a certain amount about you from observing you and watching how you do things. But ultimately, I can only know you if you choose to reveal yourself to me. And it's the same with God. We can only know God if God chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is that God has done that, and he's done it kind of in a way that you might expect or which makes sense. Because if God is going to reveal himself to us as human beings, what's the logical way to do that? Is to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus that convinces me that this world has a creator and that creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what's the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is that we do know Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed. First of all, outside the New Testament. The Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about Jesus. The first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. And some say, well, the New Testament was written a long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially the way this works is the more manuscripts we have and the closer in time they are to the original, the more sure we can be about the original. So a few examples for you. Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900. There's a 1300-year time lapse, and there's 8 copies of each, and no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap. We have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, a 950-year time gap, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap and 20 copies. But when it comes to the New Testament, it's unique amongst ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and the closeness in time to the original. The New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 others. And that's why the classical scholar F.J. Hort, an expert in these things, said, in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. And again, no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but who is he? Well, we know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences, the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, of bereavement, of suffering, being tortured, and even the experience of death. And many today would say, well, okay, he was a human being, but he was only a human being. Maybe he was some sort of great religious teacher, but he was no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, there are two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was any more than a human being, then that's, some kind of great religious teacher, and that's pretty much the end of the argument. And some people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God, and it's true, he didn't walk around with a t-shirt on saying, I am God. But I think when you look at everything he taught and said, there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. So that's the first part of the argument. But the second is, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So firstly, what did he say about himself? Well, Jesus' teaching was centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, by pointing to himself, pointed to God. He said, it's through me that you come into a relationship with God. And I don't know how you're doing tonight, whether you're up or you're down, whether you feel like you're smashing life, hitting home runs for fun, or whether you're having a really difficult time. I've had times in my life when I thought I'd been doing really well. I've been doing a job that I love. I've been earning lots of money, going on great holidays, having a great life, great fun, going out to great places. And it's fun working as a barrister. It's fun. You get to work with interesting people. People who people who are alleged to have smuggled, large quantities of drugs. They're interesting people. You need a bit of charisma to be a cartel, kind of head. Those people are fun to spend time with every now and again. And, it's interesting. And plus, when you go to parties as a criminal barrister, everyone's really interested in what you do. They think it's fascinating. And they're interested in you. And so it's really interesting. And they want to talk more about it. And it was even better if they knew the people I worked with. Because the people I worked with were like the best people in the country at what they did. So if they knew a bit about the area, they'd say, oh, you work with them? They're brilliant. You must be brilliant. And I go, no. But inside I was thinking, yes. Still struggle a bit with pride. And so I really loved it. But even though I had all these good things in my life, great things in my life, good things, and lots of them, it was like I couldn't get enough of the things I loved. Like I could get loads of them, but I still wanted more, a bit more money, a bit more status, a bit more success. Even with all the things I put into my life, it was like I had some kind of spiritual hunger which I couldn't quite satisfy. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And that's what I found. And then there's the stuff in my life I don't really like the bad habits, the stuff I find very addictive, like Instagram, or comparing yourself to people, which is basically the same thing. I love Instagram, it's really fun, but you can get a little bit thirsty for likes, or particularly thirsty from likes from certain people. I don't know if you've ever scrolled through your likes to see if that particular person who you quite like, has liked what you have put up. I'm sure no one here has ever done that, but sometimes you can feel, and it's funny because there's something about Instagram, you can be having a great day, but then if you see that one of your friends is like having an even better day, like they were invited to the super, super exclusive party, or they just happened to meet Barack Obama in Starbucks, it's like great, it's like thanks for sharing that with me, but suddenly my day doesn't look quite so good. It's like you compare your behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reel. And I've struggled with a number of those things that I found addictive. And Jesus said, if the Son, talking about himself, if the Son sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And that's also my experience, that Jesus set me free from all sorts of things, like a bad temper. Some things happen like that. Some things, it's been a longer process. And then there's stuff like guilt, worry, and anxiety. I wonder if you had the experience like I have of you make a big mistake at work, or you fall out with a friend and you can't see a way of fixing it. And you find yourself kind of waking up at 2 a.m., can't really get back to sleep, and you just start thinking, is this all going to be okay? And Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You'll find peace. Jesus says, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you've seen me, you have seen God. And we've all probably come across people who perhaps don't have a huge amount of self-awareness or modesty, seem to think they're God's gift to the world, think maybe to see what God looks like, they only have to look in the mirror. Maybe you've got a boss like that, or an ex. And what I find interesting, Jesus didn't have a trace of arrogance in his nature. And yet he said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. So firstly, his teaching was centered on himself. But secondly, his indirect claims. Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. For example, Jesus said to people he had never met before, your sins are forgiven. I mean, can you imagine trying that on the tube tomorrow morning, just going up to randoms, like, your sins are forgiven. Your sins are... I mean, how would that go? What do people say, like, thanks? Like, what? He went up to people and said that. And the lawyers said, wait a minute, to forgive those who sinned against others, that's something that only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins, to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And then the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. And I don't have time to look at all of them, but if you just look at one, if someone said to you, oh, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only had time to show them one verse, show them this one. So the background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God was considered blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders, and it was considered worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus says this in John 10, verse 30. He says, I and the Father are one. Again, they, the religious leaders, picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they said, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. Those who were around him, those who heard him and opposed him, they said, you're claiming to be God. They were in no doubt about what he was claiming. And they said he deserved to die for it. So so from his teaching, his indirect, his direct claims, the evidence seems to be strongly suggests that Jesus did claim to be God. Now, obviously, that's a remarkable claim, and it deserves to be tested. And it seems to me there are three possibilities. The first is that it wasn't true, and Jesus knew it was untrue, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and he was an evil one at that. Now, the second possibility is it wasn't true, but he really thought it was true. He didn't realize it. So he thought he was God, even though he wasn't actually God. And we would call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So was Jesus right in what he claimed? What evidence is there to support what he said? Well, the first thing to look at is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do to you. And then this, completely revolutionary, he was the first to say it, love your enemies as yourself. Jesus' teaching has been like the foundation of really our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. And then think about this. We've advanced in almost every field of science. Just think about all the technological achievements just of the last 10 years. I mean, nanotechnology, brain implants, Tinder. Did it? But in 2,000 years, no one's ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you'd expect God to speak. And then his life, the things that he did. He must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. People sometimes say, oh, is Christianity boring? It wouldn't have been boring being around Jesus. Just want you to imagine for a second that you're facing a serious moral dilemma at work. And you've got one call, maybe it's an ethical issue or something. You've got one call to a mate. Who is your steady in a crisis, wise advice, dependable mate you call? Picture that person. Then I want you to imagine it's Friday night, you get a promotion, something really good happens at work, you close the account, the project goes well, and you just want to hit the town, you want to tear it up, and you want to celebrate. You've got one friend to call to go with you, who's always up for a party person, really fun, really happy, they'll be there no matter what hour of day or night. Picture that person. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, they're very different people. Like, I would never want to get them confused. It could get very messy. Like, you phone looking for ethical advice and you end up in Shoreditch in a karaoke bar at 5 a.m. Like, you don't want to go there. But the fascinating thing about Jesus is not only does he have the greatest moral teaching the world's ever seen, he went to a party and the wine runs out. So he says, you see those stone jars over there? Fill them up with 20 or 30 gallons of bathwater each and start pouring them out for guests. And they did, and it was the best wine of the night. Jesus was the one who kept the party going. But not just his miracles, his love for the loveless, his love for people whose society had written off and excluded. And the way he sets people free and still sets people free today. It's one of the things I most love about Jesus, the way he sets people free in all sorts of ways. And of course, I suppose, ultimately, his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character, the character of Jesus, has impressed millions of people who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus, the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him very well said, this guy is without sin. But as I'm sure you know, the real test of character is what you're like when you're seriously under pressure. When you make a mistake at work and your boss starts screaming at you, when the relationship in which you placed all your hopes falls apart and you're left wondering what's going to happen. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were even born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices over hundreds of years, 29 of them in a single day. And some might say, well, okay, Jesus read the New Testament, the Old Testament. Maybe he was a clever con man. He read it and he thought, oh, it's interesting, I'll go and fulfill some of these prophecies. But it doesn't work, not just because of the sheer number of them, but because there were many prophecies over which things he simply had no control over. There were prophecies over the exact manner of his death, the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. I mean, imagine Jesus reading it thinking, oh, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. You're too late. But he was born in Bethlehem, something he had no control over. And then by far the most important thing, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant to every one of us here. Every one of us is going to die. I feel a bit awkward bringing that up on a Wednesday night. But it's true, it's the ultimate statistic, isn't it? One of us in this room is going to die. And you might have noticed in the media that when a famous person dies, even in really tragic circumstances, the death is reported, and then quite quickly we move on to talking about what a wonderful person they are and the impact of their life. It's like we can't sit with the reality of death for more than a moment. It's too hard. I even heard of a hospital where they've forbidden the use of the word death. They have a much more politically correct way of talking about it. They talk about a negative patient care outcome. But the fact is we die. And I'll never forget going to the funeral of my really close friend Jamie. He died in really tragic circumstances. And kind of standing there at the graveside and seeing his coffin go into the ground. And it looks so final. It just looks like the end. And it is the end. Unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that Jesus died and was buried, and on the third day he was raised to life. And that means it's possible for each one of us to have eternal life. And that's an extraordinary claim. And it's the basis of hope at every funeral. But is it true? I mean, that's what matters. Just because it's great to believe doesn't mean it's true. So why do I believe Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I actually hadn't realized how much evidence there is that Jesus rose for the dead, for the physical resurrection of Jesus. And there are 4 reasons why I believe he rose from the dead. First of all, no one has ever really explained how Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on Easter Day. Some say, well, maybe the authorities took the body. But that's not at all likely, because if the authorities had taken the body, all they had to do when people were running around saying Jesus has risen from the dead is say, no, he isn't, here he is, da-da, and it would have solved it. Others said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But the tomb was guarded, and it's also psychologically improbable. Here were a depressed, disillusioned group of people. Look at what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something they would have known if they'd taken the body wasn't true? Well, some say, well, maybe the robbers stole the body, and that's actually the least likely of all, because I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb wasn't empty. Jesus' body was absent, and when the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing for robbers to take, had collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when a butterfly emerges from it. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been taken off and folded up and put in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. The second reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, he was present with people. He was seen by many people on different occasions. And some people say, well, is that hallucination? And yes, some people do hallucinate. Kind of people who hallucinate are highly strung, imaginative people, those on drugs. But amongst Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, who was an ultimate skeptic. You had tough, gritty fishermen. You had Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even 2 people would have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then the third reason is the immediate impact. Here were a group of people who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And something occurred that totally changed them, so that 3 days after his death, they were going around telling everybody, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon, really, because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there's this explosion in 300 years right across the whole known world. It's a story of peaceful revolution with no parallel, really, in the history of the world. And then the fourth reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the sheer number of people's lives who have been transformed by Jesus. More people today, actually, than ever before. Tens of thousands of people each day are placing their trust in Jesus. Today there are 2,300,000,000 Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. We have Christian experience down the ages, countless millions of people who have experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And it's people of every ethnicity, every continent, every nationality, every economic, social, and intellectual background, from all walks of life, uniting in this common experience of the risen Jesus. So when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say he was evil or deluded it seems to me to be unbelievable and illogical. So I'm left with the only other option. When I look at the evidence, it gives the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity was God. But there's all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. And when I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge made its way from my head to my heart. Jesus said, I have come so you might have life and life in all its fullness. And I tell you, I've had my ups and downs. I've been through difficulties. I've messed up more times than I care to remember. I am far from perfect. But I have received and I've experienced what Jesus promised. It really is true that God revealed himself in Jesus. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. There is hope in this life. Right now, in an encounter with Jesus, we find life and life in all its fullness. And that's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe he is who he claimed he was.